Hudson River Asylum. Imagine hearing whispers coming from the dark as something cold touches your shoulder. But when you turn around, there's nothing. We've entered the Hudson River Asylum, and what we find inside will haunt you for the rest of your life. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and get ready. The story begins now. The Hudson River Asylum stood on the edge of a forgotten town, its silhouette an ominous blot against the twilight sky. The building looked like it had grown out of the earth itself, its jagged edges and crumbling facade blending seamlessly with the surrounding dead trees. The air was unnaturally still, thick with the kind of silence that clings to places where something terrible has happened. Even before we crossed the threshold, there was a sense of being watched. It wasn't paranoia, it was an instinctual dread, a primal part of my brain screaming at me to turn back. But we didn't. We were too curious, too foolish, too confident in our belief that ghost stories were just that, stories. The entrance to the asylum was barely standing, the wood of the door rotted through in places, giving the illusion of jagged teeth. As we pushed it open, the sound of the rusted hinges echoed unnaturally loud in the emptiness, like a scream trapped in the hollowed-out bones of the asylum. The air inside was colder than it had any right to be, biting through our jackets and cutting to the bone. It carried an unshakable stench, a combination of mildew, decay, and something sharper, metallic, like blood that had long since dried but still lingered, staining the atmosphere. Our flashlights cut through the gloom, their beams trembling slightly as if the light itself was reluctant to illuminate what lay within. The first room we entered was a lobby of sorts, though any signs of its former purpose were buried under layers of grime and debris. Shattered glass crunched beneath our boots, and the walls were alive with graffiti, layers upon layers of spray-painted curses, cryptic symbols and warnings scrawled in what looked like blood. Most of it was illegible, but one phrase repeated itself over and over again, etched deeply into the peeling plaster. "Don't let it see you." The words weren't neatly written. They were gouged, clawed into the walls with such force that the plaster had crumbled around them. Some marks looked fresh, the edges still raw and white. Mike was the first to break the silence. "It's just vandalism," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. He glanced over his shoulder as if expecting someone or something to be standing behind him. Sarah said nothing, her lips pressed into a thin line, her flashlight beam darting nervously from shadow to shadow. I tried to laugh it off, to make some joke about urban legends, but the sound died in my throat as I caught sight of something moving at the edge of the light. A shadow, fleeting, just out of focus. We pressed on, stepping deeper into the asylum. The walls seemed to close in around us, the darkness growing thicker, more oppressive. Each step felt heavier, as though the building itself was resisting our presence. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional groan of the structure settling or the drip of water from somewhere above. But there was something else, something faint just on the edge of hearing. It sounded like breathing, slow and labored, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I tried to shake the feeling, focusing instead on the details of the corridor. The floor was littered with debris, shards of glass, scraps of paper, fragments of furniture. I bent down to pick up what looked like an old patient file, the edges brittle and yellowed with age. The text was smudged and illegible, but the photo attached to it stopped me cold. It was a black and white image of a man, his face gaunt and eyes hollow, staring directly into the camera. Something about his expression was wrong. His mouth was open, frozen mid-scream, but his eyes were calm. Too calm. A sudden noise broke my concentration, a sharp, rhythmic tapping. It echoed from somewhere deeper in the asylum, growing louder with each beat, like a countdown. We froze, exchanging uneasy glances. "Probably just the wind," Mike said, though his voice betrayed him. Sarah shook her head, gripping her flashlight tighter. "That's not the wind," she whispered. The tapping stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving us in a silence so profound it felt deafening. And then, faintly, there was laughter, high-pitched, childlike, and utterly wrong. It came from the end of the hallway, where the darkness was impenetrable. The beam of my flashlight flickered as I pointed it toward the sound. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, a figure small and hunched, darting out of sight. My pulse quickened, and I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Mike shook his head, but Sarah nodded, her face pale. "We need to leave," she said, her voice trembling. But instead of heading back, we pressed on, driven by a mix of fear and the irrational need to know. It felt like the asylum was pulling us deeper, drawing us into its rotting heart. The hallway seemed endless, each step taking us further away from the safety of the outside world. The graffiti on the walls grew more frantic, the words more unhinged. Scratches and claw marks appeared alongside them, deep gouges that looked as though they had been made by something inhuman. And then we saw it, an old wheelchair, sitting in the middle of the corridor. The chair was ancient, its metal frame rusted, and its leather seat cracked and worn. It shouldn't have been moving. There was no breeze, no draft, but it spun slowly, almost lazily, as though an unseen hand was pushing it. We stopped in our tracks, staring at it in stunned silence. For a moment, no one said a word. Then Sarah let out a shaky laugh, though there was no humor in it. "It's just physics, right? Maybe the floor's uneven?" But as we approached, the laughter faded, replaced by a growing sense of dread. There was something in the wheelchair. At first I thought it was just a pile of rags, but as the beam of my flashlight landed on it, I saw that it was a doll. Its porcelain face was cracked, one glass eye missing, the other staring blankly ahead. Its head was twisted backward at an impossible angle, and its tiny hands were clenched tightly around the arms of the chair. The air around us grew colder, and a faint sound began to rise. A whisper, soft and unintelligible, coming from all directions. It wasn't words exactly, but a sound that burrowed into my brain, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. I felt an overwhelming urge to pick up the doll, to see if it was the source of the noise. As I reached out, the whisper shifted, turning into a low, guttural growl. "Don't touch it." Sarah's voice cut through the haze, pulling me back. I stumbled away, my heart racing. The growl faded, replaced by silence once more. But the wheelchair, it stopped spinning. It was now facing us directly. The silence that followed was suffocating. The wheelchair had stopped moving, its wheels now perfectly still, angled in such a way that it felt like it was staring directly at us. The doll perched in its seat was grotesque in its brokenness. The porcelain face, cracked and smeared with a reddish-brown substance, seemed almost alive in the wavering light of our flashlights. One of its tiny hands was missing entirely, the jagged stump pointing accusingly toward us. Its remaining glass eye gleamed unnaturally in the darkness, catching the light and refracting it back at us like a predator's glare. The air felt heavier the longer we stared at it. It was as though the wheelchair was demanding our attention, holding us captive with an unseen force. Mike broke the tension with a nervous laugh, though the sound was brittle and false. "It's just a doll, for God's sake," he muttered, stepping forward to give the wheelchair a nudge. Sarah gasped, reaching out to stop him, but it was too late. The moment his hand brushed the metal frame, the temperature in the hallway plummeted. It was as though the building exhaled a long, icy breath, and with it came a sound, a low, guttural groan that reverberated through the walls. The doll's head snapped upright. Its single eye locked onto Mike, and for a fraction of a second, I could have sworn its cracked mouth twitched into something resembling a smile. Mike stumbled back, nearly tripping over the debris scattered across the floor. Did you see that?" he stammered, his bravado melting away. None of us answered. We were too busy scanning the hallway, the oppressive darkness around us now alive with subtle movement. The tapping sound returned, louder this time, echoing from somewhere deeper within the asylum. It was slow and deliberate, like the cadence of footsteps, but it wasn't coming from one direction. It was all around us. My flashlight flickered, the beam dancing erratically across the walls, and I caught glimpses of something moving in the periphery. Shadows stretched and warped, shifting unnaturally as though they had a mind of their own. They crawled up the walls and slithered across the ceiling, coiling and uncoiling like smoke. "Let's go back," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. She clutched my arm tightly, her nails digging into my skin. "We shouldn't be here. This place, it's wrong." But the hallway behind us was no longer the same. The door we had entered through was gone, replaced by a solid wall of decayed plaster and peeling paint. It was as if the asylum had swallowed us whole, closing off any escape. Mike shone his flashlight at the floor, trying to regain his composure. "It's just a trick of the light," he said, though his voice cracked with uncertainty. But even as he said it, the tapping grew louder, more insistent. It was joined by another sound, scraping, like fingernails being dragged across a chalkboard. The noise set my teeth on edge, and Sarah let out a small whimper. We had no choice but to move forward. The wheelchair stood like a silent sentinel as we passed it, its presence lingering in the back of my mind long after it disappeared from view. The hallway ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, the shadows swallowing our flashlight beams as quickly as they emerged. The walls were no longer covered in graffiti. Instead, they were streaked with long, jagged claw marks, as though something enormous had raked its way through the building. The plaster had been gouged so deeply that the underlying brick was exposed in places, the scars eerily fresh. As we walked, the sound of our footsteps seemed to grow quieter, as though the asylum was absorbing the noise. The oppressive silence returned, pressing down on us like a physical weight. My breathing felt labored, each inhale sharp and cold. "Are you hearing that?" Sarah asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. I stopped, straining to listen, and there it was again. A faint, rhythmic hum. It wasn't mechanical or natural, it was human. It sounded like someone was humming a lullaby, the melody hauntingly familiar but distorted, as though it had been played on an old, broken record. The sound led us to a branching hallway, the left path disappearing into complete darkness, while the right glowed faintly with a sickly, greenish light. "Which way?" Mike asked, glancing nervously between the two. Before we could decide, the humming stopped abruptly, replaced by the unmistakable sound of a child giggling. The laughter was high-pitched and echoing, bouncing off the walls in a way that made it impossible to locate its source. "I don't like this," Sarah muttered, taking a step back. "This isn't normal, this isn't—" Her words were cut off by a sudden, deafening bang. It sounded like a door slamming shut, but it came from both directions at once, reverberating through the hallway like a gunshot. My flashlight flickered again, plunging us into momentary darkness before sputtering back to life. When the light returned, the claw marks on the walls were deeper, almost violent in their intensity, and the greenish glow from the right hallway had turned blood red. The giggling grew louder, more distorted, until it was no longer laughter at all. It was a shrieking, a cacophony of voices layered on top of one another, screaming in agony. We covered our ears, but the sound seemed to bypass our senses entirely, burrowing directly into our skulls. It was unbearable, maddening, and I felt my knees buckle as the world spun around me. "We have to keep moving," I choked out, though I wasn't sure which way to go. The tapping returned, faster now, and it was accompanied by another sound, a dragging as though something heavy was being pulled along the floor. The air grew colder still, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me. Sarah grabbed my hand, her grip like a vice. "Run," she whispered, her voice tight with panic. "Just run." We chose the left hallway, plunging into the darkness. The sound of something chasing us was unmistakable now, its footsteps heavy and erratic. I didn't dare look back. My flashlight illuminated flashes of the path ahead. More claw marks, shattered glass, and what looked like bloodstains smeared across the walls. The sound of breathing was right behind us, ragged and wet, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Just as I thought we couldn't run any further, we stumbled into a large room. The door slammed shut behind us with a force that rattled the entire structure. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't empty. It was filled with a presence, something unseen but palpable, watching us from the shadows. And then we saw it, a single handprint on the wall, pressed deep into the plaster. It wasn't human. The room was vast and cavernous, an unexpected expanse in a building that had felt so suffocatingly narrow. Our flashlights swept across the space, illuminating patches of destruction and decay. The floor was a patchwork of cracked tiles, littered with shards of glass and bits of crumbling plaster. In the center of the room stood a solitary operating table, its metal surface corroded and stained. Rust, and something darker, something organic, had seeped into its grooves. Straps hung limply from its sides, frayed but still menacing, as though they had been torn apart by something desperate to escape. The walls were covered in peeling paint, revealing layers of faded wallpaper beneath. The pattern was disturbing in its cheerfulness. Pastel flowers and smiling animals, the kind you might expect to see in a nursery or children's ward. But time and neglect had warped it, and in the flickering light of our flashlights, the designs seemed to twist and writhe. The cheerful animals now looked grotesque, their painted eyes wide with terror, their smiles stretched into ghastly grins. None of us spoke. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint sound of dripping water somewhere above us. But there was something else, a sensation that was harder to define. It felt like the air itself was alive, pressing against our skin, vibrating with an unseen energy. I could feel it crawling up my spine, prickling the back of my neck. It wasn't just the stillness that unnerved me. It was the presence. Something was in the room with us, watching, waiting. Sarah was the first to break the silence, her voice barely audible. This isn't right. There shouldn't be a room like this here. She was right. The architectural layout of the asylum hadn't suggested anything like this cavernous space. It felt alien, out of place, like it had been added to the building as an afterthought, or like it had grown here, birthed by the asylum itself. Mike's flashlight beam landed on the operating table, and he cursed under his breath. This isn't just an operating room," he said, stepping closer despite the tension in his voice. "Look at the tools." I followed his gaze, my stomach churning at the sight. Scattered across the table were surgical instruments, their metal surfaces dulled with age and tarnished with old blood. Scalpels, bone saws, clamps. They were all there, but their design was wrong. The blades were jagged, the handles warped, as though they had been made for hands that were not entirely human. One particularly large saw was encrusted with something black, the residue flaking off in powdery chunks. It wasn't rust. Sarah grabbed my arm again, her nails digging into my flesh. Her flashlight beam had stopped moving, fixed on the far corner of the room. At first, I didn't see what she was looking at, but then my eyes adjusted to the shadows. There, partially obscured by the darkness, was a figure. It was hunched, its back turned to us, its outline barely distinguishable from the gloom. It wasn't moving, but I could tell it was alive. The way its body seemed to shiver, the subtle rise and fall of its shoulders, the faint sound of wet, rasping breaths. It was unmistakable. "Don't move," Sarah hissed, her voice trembling. But Mike, always the skeptic, took a cautious step forward. "It's probably just a mannequin," he said, though his voice was unconvincing. "Or some kind of prop. Someone's messing with us." As his foot hit the floor, the sound echoed unnaturally loud, like a stone dropping into a bottomless well. The figure's head twitched. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to send a jolt of terror through me. Slowly, impossibly slowly, the figure began to turn. The first thing I noticed was the sound, bones creaking, tendons stretching, as though the act of movement was excruciating for it. Then came the smell, a sickening stench of rot and decay that hit us like a physical force. My stomach churned and I had to fight the urge to retch. Finally, the flashlight beam caught its face, or what was left of it. The figure was not human, or at least not anymore. Its skin was pallid and stretched too tightly over its skull, its cheeks sunken and hollow. Patches of flesh were missing, exposing raw muscle and bone beneath. Its eyes were the worst part. They were too large, too bright, and they glowed faintly in the dark, like twin embers smoldering in the sockets. Its mouth was wide, impossibly wide, and filled with teeth that were too sharp, too numerous. It looked like it had been smiling for centuries, a grin that had grown monstrous with time. It opened its mouth wider, and a sound emerged that I can only describe as the death rattle of the earth itself. It wasn't a scream or a roar, it was a low, guttural groan, layered with the echoes of countless voices. It spoke no words, but the sound carried meaning. It was a warning, a curse, and a promise of suffering all at once. Mike stumbled back, his flashlight slipping from his grasp and clattering to the floor. The beam flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows that made the creature seem to multiply. It began to move toward us, its limbs jerking unnaturally, as though it was being controlled by invisible strings. Each step it took was accompanied by that awful sound of bones grinding against each other, and the floor beneath it seemed to ripple, as though the asylum itself was reacting to its presence. "Run!" Sarah screamed, pulling me toward the door. But the door was gone. In its place was a solid wall of flesh-colored material, pulsating faintly, like the wall itself was breathing. The room had changed, reshaping itself to trap us within. The creature was closer now, its glowing eyes fixed on us, its smile widening impossibly. Mike grabbed one of the surgical tools from the table, brandishing it like a weapon. "Stay back!" he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. But the creature didn't stop. It didn't even hesitate. As it reached the center of the room, the lights of our flashlights flickered and died, plunging us into total darkness. The only light now came from its eyes, casting a dim, hellish glow that painted the room in shades of crimson and black. In the faint light, I could see the walls moving, the grotesque wallpaper patterns stretching and twisting as though trying to reach for us. And then, in the suffocating darkness, it spoke. Its voice was a chorus, 1,000 whispers layered over a guttural growl. "You shouldn't have come." The words hung in the air, their weight suffocating. "You shouldn't have come." The voice had no single source. It came from everywhere at once, as if the room itself had spoken. Each syllable reverberated through my body, settling in my chest like lead. The creature's glowing eyes seared into my mind, burning with an intensity that felt as though it was peeling away layers of my sanity. The room was alive with malice, and it was growing harder to distinguish the living from the inanimate. Everything around us seemed to shift, as though reality itself was unraveling. The walls began to move. At first, it was subtle, a ripple running through the decayed plaster, but then the motion grew violent. What once appeared to be solid was now a grotesque, pulsating mass. The peeling paint and crumbling wallpaper sloughed off, revealing something wet and raw beneath. A surface that shimmered as though slick with blood or mucus. Veins coursed through the walls, bulging and throbbing with a rhythm that matched the erratic pounding of my heart. I reached out instinctively to steady myself, placing my hand against the wall. The sensation was horrifying. It wasn't cold or hard as I'd expected, but warm, clammy, and disturbingly soft. It yielded slightly under my touch like flesh. I recoiled, wiping my hand frantically on my jeans, but the feeling lingered, as if the wall had left something behind. A residue, a memory. The smell of copper and decay filled my nostrils, making it almost impossible to breathe without gagging. Sarah was sobbing now, her cries barely audible over the grotesque squelching sounds emanating from the walls. "We have to get out of here," she screamed, her voice breaking. Her flashlight was dead, and she clung to my arm like a lifeline, her nails digging deep enough to draw blood. I couldn't tell if she was trembling or if it was me, or perhaps the entire room was shuddering under the weight of its own malevolence. Mike, still clutching the rusted surgical tool, was backing away from the creature. His face was pale, his eyes wide with the kind of fear that stripped a person of reason. This can't be real," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "It's a trick. It has to be a trick." But even as he spoke, the creature took another step forward, its movements impossibly jerky and alien. Its limbs bent in ways that defied anatomy, its joints popping with sickening cracks as it advanced. The floor beneath it was no longer solid. It rippled like a liquid, dark and viscous, bubbling as though it was alive. With each step the creature took, the floor absorbed its weight, sucking at its feet before releasing them with a wet, slurping sound. The room itself seemed to recoil from the creature, yet it also bent to its will, shifting and reshaping to accommodate its movements. "Do you feel it?" The voice whispered again, this time more intimate, more invasive. It wasn't just a sound, it was a thought planted directly in my mind, a sensation that crawled through my skull and coiled around my brain like a parasite. The walls remember. They remember the screams, the blood, the pain. They remember you. Suddenly the walls erupted with sound, a cacophony of screams that filled every corner of the room. They were the cries of agony, despair, and madness, layered over one another in a chaotic symphony. It was as though the walls were vomiting up the memories they held, each scream a fragment of some unspeakable torment. I covered my ears, but it was futile. The sound wasn't just external, it was inside me, vibrating through my bones, threatening to shatter my mind. Mike let out a strangled cry and lunged at the creature, raising the jagged surgical tool high above his head. He moved with the desperation of a man who had nothing left to lose, his face contorted with terror and rage. The creature didn't flinch. As Mike brought the tool down, it struck the creature's shoulder, but instead of piercing flesh, the blade sank into it as though it was plunging into quicksand. Black, tar-like fluid oozed from the wound, hissing and smoking as it dripped onto the floor. The creature turned its head toward Mike, its mouth stretching wider, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and then it laughed. The sound was more horrific than anything I could have imagined, a guttural, choking cackle that bubbled up from its throat and echoed through the room. It wasn't just mocking Mike, it was mocking all of us, as though our terror was a source of amusement. Before Mike could react, the creature's arm shot out, its clawed hand wrapping around his wrist. The movement was so fast I barely registered it. Mike screamed as the creature's grip tightened, the sound of bones snapping like dry twigs filling the air. It lifted him effortlessly, his body dangling like a rag doll. For a moment, I thought it was going to tear him apart, but instead, it hurled him across the room. Mike's body hit the wall with a sickening thud, and he crumpled to the floor, unmoving. Sarah screamed, and I grabbed her, pulling her back as the creature turned its attention to us. Its eyes burned brighter, illuminating the room in a hellish glow. The walls responded, the veins pulsing faster, the fleshy surface rippling as though something was trying to break free from within. Shapes began to emerge, faces, dozens of them, pressing against the wall as if they were trapped just beneath the surface. Their features were distorted, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes wide with eternal terror. "Do you see?" The voice whispered again, now coming from the walls themselves. "This is their prison, and now it's yours." The floor beneath us began to shift, softening, liquefying. My boots sank into the surface, the dark tar-like substance pulling at me, threatening to drag me down. Sarah clung to me, her sobs turning into incoherent pleas. "We can't stay here," I said, though my voice was barely steady. "We have to move." But there was nowhere to go. The walls, the floor, even the air itself seemed alive, working against us. The creature took another step forward, its mouth stretching impossibly wide, a black void that promised nothing but oblivion. The glow from its eyes intensified, and I realized with dawning horror that it wasn't just looking at us. It was consuming us, feeding on our fear, our despair. And then the laughter returned, not from the creature this time, but from the walls, the faces, the room itself. It was everywhere, a chorus of madness that threatened to drown out my thoughts. The walls were closing in, the fleshy surface undulating as though preparing to swallow us whole. This wasn't just a room. It was a living entity, a predator that had lured us into its lair, and we were its prey. The moment I tried to move, I realized we were trapped. The floor, now a viscous, pulsating mass, gripped my feet like quicksand. Every step was a monumental struggle, my boots sinking deeper with each passing second. I could feel it pulling at me, the tar-like substance clinging to my legs, creeping higher, its cold, slimy texture sending chills through my entire body. Sarah whimpered at my side, her voice trembling with panic. "I can't move," she sobbed. Her hands clawed at my arm, her nails biting into my skin as though she thought anchoring herself to me might save her. The creature was advancing, its movements grotesque and staccato, as if its limbs were controlled by invisible jerking strings. Its glowing eyes remained fixed on us, and its mouth was stretched into an impossibly wide grin, exposing rows of jagged, uneven teeth. Each step it took seemed to resonate through the room, the fleshy walls rippling and throbbing in response. Behind it, the faces pressing against the walls twisted and contorted, their silent screams growing more pronounced, as if the creature's presence was tormenting them further. "Help me!" Sarah shrieked, but her voice was swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere of the room. The air itself felt heavier, thicker, as though it had turned to a miasma of despair. Breathing was a conscious effort, each inhale dragging the stench of rot and decay deeper into my lungs. My flashlight flickered weakly, the beam barely penetrating the darkness, and I realized it wasn't the light failing, it was the darkness growing stronger, thicker, almost sentient in its hunger. I yanked at Sarah's arm, forcing her to take a step. The black sludge reluctantly released her foot with a grotesque, wet squelch. "We need to keep moving," I shouted, though my voice was hoarse and ragged. But where could we go? The walls had closed in, the doorway long gone, replaced by undulating, fleshy barriers that pulsed as if they had a heartbeat. The only open space was behind us, leading deeper into the room, toward the creature. Mike was still on the ground, motionless. His body lay crumpled like a discarded puppet, one arm bent at an unnatural angle. For a moment I thought he was dead, but then I saw his fingers twitch, a faint, almost imperceptible movement. "Mike!" I called out, but he didn't respond. His head lolled to the side, and I saw the terror etched into his face. His eyes were open, wide and glassy, staring at something I couldn't see. His lips moved, mouthing words that didn't make sense. His voice, lost in the cacophony of screams echoing from the walls. The creature took another step forward, and suddenly the walls began to shift again. This time, they didn't just ripple, they opened. Gaping wounds tore through the flesh-like surface, revealing dark, yawning voids that pulsed with a faint, sickly light. From these voids emerged grotesque appendages, long and sinewy, with too many joints and clawed tips. The appendages writhed like they were alive, reaching out, their movements deliberate and searching. One of them grazed the floor, its claws scraping against the tiles with a sound that sent shivers down my spine. The faces in the walls began to move, their mouths opening wide in unison. From their gaping maws came a sound so horrifying it defied description, a low, guttural wail that seemed to vibrate through the air, penetrating my very soul. It wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling, an overwhelming sense of despair and futility. It was the sound of countless lives lost, of endless suffering, of hope extinguished. "Do you hear them?" The voice whispered again, slithering into my mind like a serpent. "They were like you once, lost, desperate, and now they are part of me." The black substance beneath us surged upward suddenly, splashing against my legs. It was colder now, almost freezing, and the chill seeped into my bones. I could feel it creeping higher as though it was alive, as though it was trying to pull me under. My panic rose, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. I grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her with all my strength, forcing us both to take another step. The creature paused, its head cocking to the side in a disturbingly curious manner. It was studying us, observing our struggle, as though it was savoring our fear. Then, it raised one of its grotesque arms and pointed toward the ground. At first, I didn't understand what it was doing, but then I felt it. The floor beneath us was no longer solid. It was collapsing, giving way to something far worse. A massive crack split the room, running from one end to the other, and from it came a blinding light. The light wasn't comforting or warm. It was harsh, cold, and filled with a terrible sense of emptiness. As the crack widened, the floor fell away, revealing an abyss beneath us. It wasn't just darkness. It was nothingness, an infinite void that seemed to stretch forever. The sight of it made my stomach churn, my mind struggling to comprehend the sheer enormity of it. The creature took another step, its grin widening further as though it was enjoying our terror. The appendages from the walls writhed with renewed vigor, reaching toward us, their clawed tips snapping hungrily. One of them grazed Sarah's arm, tearing through her sleeve and leaving a deep, bloody scratch. She screamed, her voice raw with pain and fear, and stumbled, nearly falling into the abyss. I caught her just in time, pulling her back, but the effort left us both sinking deeper into the tar-like substance. "I can't do this," Sarah sobbed, tears streaming down her face. "I can't." "Yes, you can," I said, though my voice shook with doubt. "We're getting out of here. We have to." But even as I said the words, I knew they were a lie. There was no escape. The walls, the floor, the creature, they were all part of the same thing. The room wasn't just alive, it was a predator, a sentient entity that had lured us here, trapping us in its web. And now it was closing in, savoring the moment before it devoured us. The crack in the floor widened further, the light from the abyss growing brighter, more intense. The walls began to collapse inward, the appendages retracting as though they were being absorbed into the void. The creature stepped closer, its glowing eyes burning brighter, its grin stretching so wide it seemed as though its face might split in two. And then, as the floor beneath us began to give way completely, the voice spoke one last time, soft and mocking. "You were warned, but you didn't listen." At the moment the floor gave way, my body was seized by an impossible weightlessness, like the cruel punch of a nightmare when you realize you're falling. But this was no dream. I could feel the air rushing past me, its coldness biting into my skin like daggers. The abyss below was infinite, a void that seemed to devour all light and sound. The screams of Sarah and Mike were swallowed by the oppressive darkness, leaving only the thunderous beat of my own heart hammering in my ears. I reached out blindly, clawing at the air, desperate to find something, anything to stop the plunge into nothingness. The darkness wasn't empty. I could feel it pressing against me, wrapping itself around my body like a living shroud. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was a presence, an awareness. It slithered against my skin, probing, testing, whispering silent, incomprehensible things into my ears. My flashlight was gone. Its weak glow extinguished the moment we fell, leaving me completely blind. The sensation of falling stretched on for what felt like eternity, the abyss mocking me with its endless, suffocating embrace. Then, without warning, the descent ended. I hit the ground hard, the impact jarring every bone in my body. Pain erupted through me, sharp and searing, but it was the least of my concerns. The surface beneath me wasn't solid. It squirmed and writhed, like a bed of snakes, shifting and pulsating beneath my weight. I scrambled to my feet, my hands sinking into the grotesque, gelatinous substance. It clung to my fingers, sticky and warm, pulsating with a sickening rhythm that mirrored a heartbeat. My own, or something far worse. "Sarah," I shouted, my voice echoing strangely in the cavernous void. The sound was distorted, warped, as though the darkness itself was twisting it. There was no answer, only the relentless squelching of the ground beneath me. Panic clawed at my chest as I called out again, louder this time. "Mike! Sarah!" Still nothing. The oppressive silence that followed was deafening, a weight that pressed down on me, threatening to crush me under its sheer enormity. A faint sound broke through the silence, so subtle at first that I thought I'd imagined it. A soft, wet slapping, like footsteps in mud, coming from somewhere behind me. I turned sharply, straining my eyes against the darkness, but there was nothing. No light, no shapes, just an infinite void. Yet the sound persisted, growing louder, closer. My breath quickened, each inhale a ragged gasp, as the reality of my situation settled in. I wasn't alone down here. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and for a moment the silence returned, heavier than before. Then a voice, soft, almost tender, whispered from the darkness, "You've fallen so far. It wasn't like the voice from the asylum above. This one was intimate, personal, as though it was speaking directly into my mind. It carried a note of mockery, a cruel amusement that sent chills coursing down my spine. "Do you see it now? The truth?" "What truth?" I demanded, though my voice was shaky, the fear creeping in despite my efforts to remain calm. My question hung in the air, unanswered, as the darkness around me seemed to shift, growing denser, more oppressive. A faint glow appeared in the distance, flickering like a dying ember. It wasn't comforting. The light was cold and sickly, casting eerie shadows that danced and writhed as if alive. Against my better judgment, I moved toward it, each step a struggle as the ground clung to my feet, resisting every movement. The closer I got, the more I realized the glow wasn't static. It pulsed like the light of a heartbeat, growing brighter and dimmer in an irregular rhythm. The source of the light was a figure, standing motionless in the void. As I approached, I saw that it wasn't human. Its form was tall and emaciated, its limbs elongated and unnaturally thin, ending in claw-like fingers that twitched sporadically. Its face was featureless, save for two deep, hollow sockets where eyes should have been. Yet I felt its gaze, a piercing, invasive presence that stripped away every layer of my being, leaving me exposed and vulnerable. "Do you understand?" the figure asked, its voice echoing in my mind. It didn't move, but I could feel it pressing closer, its presence suffocating. "This is where they all come, all who enter, all who wander too far. This is the place beneath the place, the heart of it all." I couldn't respond. My mouth was dry, my throat constricted, as though the words were being stolen from me before I could speak them. The figure tilted its head, as if amused by my silence, and raised one clawed hand. With a sharp, jerking motion, it pointed to the ground beneath me. I looked down and immediately wished I hadn't. The surface was no longer just a writhing, gelatinous mass. It was alive, faces pressed against it, their features twisted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams. I could see their eyes wide and desperate, pleading for help. But their expressions weren't frozen, they moved. The faces shifted and contorted, their eyes following me, their mouths forming words I couldn't hear. "They were like you," the figure said, its tone almost wistful. "Curious, foolish. Now they are part of me." "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "This isn't real. It can't be real." The figure laughed, a hollow, chilling sound that resonated through the abyss. "Real?" it echoed, its voice dripping with mockery. "What is real in a place like this? Reality is what I make it. And now, you are mine." Before I could react, the ground beneath me began to shift again. The faces disappeared, replaced by an endless series of grotesque, gaping mouths. They snapped and gnashed, their teeth jagged and blood-stained as they rose up, reaching for me. The ground was no longer solid. It was a living thing, hungry and vengeful, determined to consume me whole. I stumbled back, my foot slipping into one of the mouths, its teeth clamped down, tearing through my boot and into my flesh. I screamed, the pain searing and immediate as I struggled to pull free. The mouth released me, but the damage was done. Blood poured from the wound, staining the black surface beneath me. The mouths licked at it greedily, their tongues grotesquely long and snake-like. "You cannot escape," the figure said, its voice now cold and final. "There is no escape." The glow around it intensified, and I realized with horror that the light wasn't emanating from the figure itself, but from something behind it, something massive and incomprehensible. A towering shape loomed in the darkness, its form shifting and pulsating, impossible to fully comprehend. It was the source of the whispers, the screams, the madness. It was the abyss itself. As I stood frozen, the figure stepped aside, revealing the monstrous entity in all its horrific glory. And then it spoke, not in words, but in thoughts, feelings, and sensations that overwhelmed me completely. It wasn't just a voice. It was everything, everywhere, all at once. And it wanted me. The thing before me defied logic. its enormity surpassing comprehension. It was not a creature, not in any conventional sense. It was existence corrupted, the embodiment of something far older and more malevolent than time itself. Its form shifted constantly, a mass of tendrils, mouths, and countless unblinking eyes. Each tendril seemed to be made of writhing shadows, twisting and knotting in impossible ways, as though the very fabric of reality rebelled against its presence. The mouths, scattered across its surface in grotesque disarray, gnashed and snarled, their teeth stained red with the blood of countless victims. I was frozen in place, every muscle locked in primal terror. Its many eyes bored into me not with malice, but with a cold, detached hunger. It wasn't just watching me, it was consuming me already, stripping away the fragile layers of my mind piece by piece. I could feel it rooting through my thoughts, my memories, tearing into the essence of who I was. It wasn't simply devouring my flesh. It was unraveling my soul. The whispers returned, louder now, a cacophony of voices overlapping and intertwining. Some were faint and pleading, others guttural and commanding, but all of them were directed at me. "Stay," they urged. "Join us. Become part of the whole." My knees buckled, and I fell to the pulsating ground, the slick, living surface quivering beneath me. The mouths on the ground snarled and snapped, some licking at the air as if tasting my despair. I couldn't look away from the abyssal entity, even though every instinct screamed at me to run. My mind was flooded with images, flashes of lives consumed, of people just like me who had stumbled into this unholy place and never escaped. I saw them, saw their faces twisting in agony as they were drawn into the thing's endless depths. And I saw what became of them afterward, their forms broken down, fragmented, turned into the haunting faces pressed against the walls above. They were still alive, in some grotesque, nightmarish way, their consciousnesses trapped in eternal torment. The figure that had been guiding me stood silently to the side, its hollow eye sockets fixed on me. It raised a clawed hand, gesturing toward the creature, and I felt a pressure in my chest, as though something was pulling me forward. "This is where all paths lead," it said, its voice low and reverent. "The heart of the abyss. It has waited for you." "No," I managed to choke out, my voice raw and trembling. "I don't belong here." "But you do," the figure replied, taking a step closer. Its movements were slow and deliberate, its elongated limbs swaying unnaturally. "You were drawn to this place just as they all were. You sought the darkness, and now it has found you." My body refused to obey as the tendrils of the abyss began to extend toward me, their tips curling and uncurling like the fingers of a predator savoring its prey. They moved with a terrible grace, almost hypnotic in their fluidity, and I realized with mounting dread that they weren't just reaching for me, they were reaching into me. The first tendril brushed against my arm, and the sensation was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was cold, impossibly cold, but it burned at the same time, a searing pain that radiated through my entire body. I screamed, thrashing against the ground, but the tendril held firm. It wasn't physical pain, it was something deeper, more profound, as though it was siphoning pieces of me away. Memories, emotions, fragments of my identity were being pulled into the void, leaving me hollow and disoriented. "Fight it," a voice called out, distant and faint. It took me a moment to realize it was Sarah. I turned my head, straining to see through the suffocating darkness, and there she was, standing several feet away, her face pale but determined. Blood dripped from the gash on her arm, and her eyes were wide with fear. But she was alive. "Don't let it take you," she shouted, her voice cracking. Her presence was like a lifeline, cutting through the oppressive weight of the abyss. I focused on her voice, clinging to it as the tendrils tightened their grip. "Sarah," I gasped, my voice barely above a whisper. "Run. Get out of here." "I'm not leaving you," she yelled back, stepping closer. The ground squelched beneath her feet, the mouths snapping hungrily as she moved. One of the tendrils lashed out toward her, but she dodged it, her movements frantic and desperate. "You're not going to die down here." The abyss seemed to react to her defiance. The tendrils surged forward, their movements more erratic and aggressive, as though they were angered by her intrusion. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, their overlapping voices forming a single unified word: mine. I felt the pressure in my chest intensify, the pull of the abyss growing stronger. My vision blurred, the edges of my consciousness fraying as the darkness closed in. But Sarah's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and unwavering. "Get up," she screamed. "Don't let it win." Her words ignited something within me, a spark of resistance buried beneath the suffocating weight of despair. With every ounce of strength I had left, I forced myself to move, clawing at the ground to pull myself away from the tendrils. The pain was excruciating, the tendrils fighting to keep their hold on me, but I refused to give in. The figure stepped forward, its hollow eye sockets narrowing as it watched me struggle. "You cannot escape," it said, its voice cold and final. "You are already part of it." "Shut up," Sarah shouted, grabbing a jagged piece of debris from the ground and hurling it at the figure. The object struck its chest, passing straight through as though it weren't solid. The figure didn't flinch, but the distraction was enough. The tendrils faltered, their grip loosening just enough for me to pull free. I stumbled to my feet, every muscle screaming in protest, and reached for Sarah. She grabbed my hand, her grip firm and steady despite the fear in her eyes. Together we ran, the ground beneath us shifting and writhing as the abyss roared in fury. The tendrils lashed out wildly, narrowly missing us as we dodged and weaved, our footsteps echoing in the endless void. The glow of the abyss began to fade behind us, its light replaced by an encroaching darkness that seemed to pulse with anger. The whispers grew fainter, the voices receding into the background, but I knew we weren't safe. The abyss was alive, and it wouldn't let us go so easily. As we ran, I glanced over my shoulder one last time and saw the figure standing motionless in the distance, its hollow gaze fixed on me. "You can't run forever," it said, its voice echoing in my mind. The abyss is always watching. The path ahead was no longer discernible. It was a churning, chaotic expanse of shifting blackness that defied all logic. Each step felt treacherous, as though the ground itself might give way at any moment, plunging us back into the endless void we had just fled. My hand gripped Sarah's tightly, her presence the only tether keeping me anchored to some semblance of reality. But the abyss wasn't done with us. It whispered still, though faintly now, a background hum of incoherent words that clawed at my mind like ghostly fingers. The oppressive darkness around us grew heavier, almost tactile, as if it were alive and pressing against our skin. The air felt thicker, colder with every passing second, making each breath a laborious task. I glanced back, half expecting to see the figure from before, or worse, the abyssal entity itself, chasing us. But there was only darkness, an endless sea of black that seemed to stretch into eternity. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, lurking just beyond the edge of perception, watching, waiting. "We can't stop," Sarah said, her voice trembling but resolute. Her face was pale, streaked with dirt and blood, but her eyes burned with determination. "Whatever that thing was, it's still coming. I can feel it." She wasn't wrong. The whispers had changed, their tone shifting from incoherent murmurs to something more deliberate, more purposeful. They weren't just voices anymore. They were thoughts, intrusive and invasive, worming their way into my mind. Images began to flash before my eyes, disjointed and horrific. A woman screaming as her body was consumed by the tendrils, her flesh dissolving into the writhing mass. A child's face, pale and lifeless, its hollow eyes staring back at me. The figure with the clawed hands, standing in a corridor of endless doors, each one opening to reveal unspeakable horrors. The visions were so vivid, so real, that I stumbled, nearly dragging Sarah down with me. "What is it?" she asked, her voice laced with panic. "It's in my head," I gasped, clutching at my temples as the images continued to assault me. I can't stop seeing it." Sarah shook me, her grip firm and grounding. "Focus on me," she said, her voice cutting through the haze of terror. "It's not real. None of it is real." But it felt real. The whispers, the visions, the cold, suffocating darkness, they were all too vivid, too immediate, to be dismissed as mere tricks of the mind. The abyss was still with us, even if we had escaped its physical grasp. It was inside us now, a parasite feeding on our fear, our despair. As we pressed forward, the terrain began to change. The once smooth, undulating surface gave way to something more solid, more structured. Jagged walls rose up on either side, their surfaces slick and glistening with a strange, viscous substance that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. The walls were close, uncomfortably so, forcing us to walk single file as the space narrowed. This wasn't here before," Sarah muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's changing," I said, my voice hollow. "It's adapting to us." The corridor twisted and turned without rhyme or reason, a labyrinth of shifting shadows that seemed designed to confuse and disorient. Every turn felt the same, every wall identical, making it impossible to tell if we were making progress or simply wandering in circles. The whispers grew louder, echoing off the walls in a dissonant symphony that made my skin crawl. And then came the sound. A low, guttural growl, reverberating through the corridor like the rumble of distant thunder. It was deep and primal, a sound that bypassed logic and struck directly at the most ancient, instinctual part of my brain. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as the growl echoed again, closer this time. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, too afraid to speak. The growl came again, and this time it was accompanied by the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against stone. Whatever was out there, it was big, and it was coming for us. "We have to keep moving," Sarah said, pulling me forward. Her grip on my hand was like a vice, her determination a stark contrast to the terror etched across her face. The corridor widened slightly, revealing a branching path ahead. 3 passages, each identical to the last, stretched out before us, their entrances yawning like the mouths of beasts. There were no signs, no markers, nothing to indicate which path might lead to safety or further into the abyss. "What do we do?" I asked, panic rising in my voice. "We choose," Sarah said, her jaw set. "We can't stay here." The growl echoed again, louder now, followed by the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps. It was no longer distant. Whatever it was here, somewhere in the labyrinth with us. "Left," I said, making the decision before I could second-guess myself. We turned down the leftmost corridor, the walls closing in around us once more. The air grew colder, the whispers louder as though the abyss itself was displeased with our choice. The sound of footsteps followed us, their pace slow and methodical. It was toying with us, drawing out the chase, savoring our fear. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a deafening drum that threatened to drown out all other sounds. I glanced back, but there was nothing there, just the endless darkness, shifting and writhing like a living thing. As we rounded a corner, the corridor opened into a vast chamber, its walls covered in strange, pulsating growths that emitted a faint, sickly glow. The ground was littered with debris, broken furniture, discarded medical equipment, and scattered bones. "This must be part of the asylum," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "What's left of it anyway?" Before I could respond, the growl came again, this time from directly behind us. I spun around, my flashlight illuminating the corridor we had just exited, but there was nothing there. No movement, no shadows, just the oppressive darkness. But I could feel it. It was there, watching us, waiting. "We're not alone," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I know," Sarah replied, her grip on my arm tightening. The air grew heavy, almost suffocating as the presence drew closer. And then, from the shadows, a figure emerged, a hulking, monstrous form, its body twisted and grotesque. Its eyes burned with an unnatural light, and its mouth was filled with rows of jagged teeth that gleamed in the sickly glow of the chamber. It didn't charge. It didn't roar. It simply stood there staring at us with a malevolent intelligence that sent chills coursing down my spine. And then it smiled. The thing stood there, its smile a grotesque mockery of human expression. It was wrong, entirely wrong, a hideous distortion of everything familiar. Its hulking frame barely fit within the chamber, its shoulders brushing against the pulsating walls as though the space itself rebelled against its presence. The skin, or what passed for it, was stretched taut over its grotesquely elongated limbs, veined with a sickly green light that pulsed faintly in the dim chamber. It tilted its head in a deliberate, unnatural motion, the bones in its neck cracking audibly, as if it relished the discomfort it caused. The smile was the worst part. It wasn't just a physical gesture. It radiated a profound, malevolent joy, as though it took pleasure not merely in the terror it inspired, but in the inevitability of what was to come. The rows of jagged teeth, impossibly white and gleaming, seemed to shimmer with a malevolent light, each one a dagger poised to rend flesh from bone. Sarah was the first to react. She took a step back, her breathing shallow and ragged. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, trembling under the weight of her fear. "I don't know," I replied, though the words felt hollow. I knew what it was, or at least what it represented. It was hunger, malice, the abyss given form, its essence distilled into this abominable being. The creature took a step forward, the sound of its massive footfall echoing through the chamber like a gunshot. The floor beneath it groaned and buckled, and the debris scattered across the room trembled as if recoiling from its presence. Each step was deliberate, purposeful, as though it was savoring the chase, the fear. The room's glow seemed to flicker in rhythm with the creature's movements, casting erratic, shifting shadows that danced across the walls. The pulsating growths lining the chamber began to throb more intensely, their light synchronizing with the thing's heartbeat, or perhaps ours, as if the chamber itself was alive, feeding off our terror. "We need to move," Sarah said, her voice hoarse but resolute. She grabbed my arm, her grip like a vice, and began pulling me toward the opposite end of the room. But the creature wasn't in any hurry. It let us go, watching as we stumbled through the debris, its smile widening ever so slightly. It knew we had nowhere to go, that this labyrinth was its domain. The sense of futility was overwhelming, a crushing weight that bore down on me with every step. The chamber led into another corridor, this one narrower and more claustrophobic than the last. The walls were slick with the same viscous substance as before, but now they seemed to writhe faintly, as though alive. The air was thick with the stench of decay, a cloying, acrid odor that made my stomach churn. Behind us, the creature's footsteps echoed, slow and deliberate. It wasn't chasing us. It was herding us, guiding us deeper into the labyrinth, where it could take its time. The realization sent a shiver down my spine. We weren't running from it. We were being led by it, our every move anticipated, controlled. "What does it want?" I asked, my voice cracking under the weight of my fear. "To feed," Sarah replied grimly. "To consume us, like everything else in this place." The corridor twisted and turned, its layout seemingly random, yet every turn felt deliberate, as though the labyrinth itself was conspiring with the creature. The walls closed in further, the pulsating light casting eerie, shifting patterns that played tricks on my mind. I could hear the whispers again, faint but insistent, their voices overlapping in a maddening chorus. "Give in. Stop running. It's easier this way." The whispers weren't just in my ears, they were in my head, filling every corner of my mind with their insidious suggestions. I shook my head violently, trying to block them out, but they only grew louder, more persistent. "Don't listen to them," Sarah shouted, her voice cutting through the din. She grabbed my shoulders, forcing me to focus on her. "They're trying to break you. Don't let them." I nodded, though the effort of resisting the whispers was almost unbearable. Each step felt heavier, my legs leaden and uncooperative, as though the labyrinth itself was sapping my strength. And then the corridor opened into another chamber, this one larger but even more grotesque than the last. The walls were lined with twisted, malformed faces, their features frozen in expressions of agony. Their mouths moved soundlessly as though screaming, but no sound escaped. "What is this place?" I whispered, horrified. "It's a graveyard," Sarah replied, her voice hollow. "These are the ones who didn't escape." The faces turned toward us as we entered, their eyes following our movements. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, as though the faces themselves were speaking, their silent screams replaced by words in my mind. "Stay with us. You belong here. There's no escape." The creature entered the chamber behind us, its massive frame filling the entrance. Its smile had widened to an impossible degree, its jagged teeth glinting in the faint light. It raised one clawed hand, pointing directly at me, and for a moment, the whispers stopped. "You," it said, its voice a guttural, bone-chilling rasp that reverberated through the chamber. "You will be mine." The faces on the walls began to move, their expressions shifting from agony to something worse, anticipation. Their mouths opened wider, their eyes gleaming with a sick, twisted joy. The walls seemed to close in, the faces pressing closer, their whispers blending into a cacophony of madness. "Run!" Sarah screamed, but there was nowhere to go. The chamber had no other exits, no doors, no corridors, just the creature, the faces, and the suffocating darkness. And then the ground beneath us began to shift, the pulsating growth splitting open to reveal gaping maws lined with rows of needle-like teeth. The room itself was alive, and it was hungry. The ground beneath us came alive with a grotesque vigor, the pulsating growths rupturing into yawning maws, each lined with rows of jagged, glistening teeth that gnashed hungrily at the air. The sound was unbearable, a cacophony of wet, tearing noises, as though the floor itself was reveling in its transformation into a living, carnivorous nightmare. The entire chamber trembled with an insidious vitality, the walls throbbing in unison with the maws, their grotesque rhythm seemingly synced with the creature's malevolent presence. Sarah and I scrambled backward, our feet slipping on the viscous slime that coated the floor. The air was thick with the acrid stench of decay, mixed with something far worse, a cloying metallic tang that burned my nostrils and made my stomach churn. The faces on the walls began to chant in unison, their voices rising above the din of snapping jaws and guttural growls. "You are home. You are ours. The abyss claims you." The creature stood at the threshold of the chamber, its massive frame silhouetted against the pulsating light. It watched us with a cruel, predatory amusement, its twisted smile now impossibly wide, stretching across its monstrous face like a gaping wound. It took a deliberate step forward, its claws clicking against the floor, and the room seemed to shudder in response, the maws snapping more frantically as if in anticipation of its command. Sarah grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin as she pulled me away from the advancing chaos. "We have to move," she shouted, her voice barely audible over the deafening noise. "There's nowhere to go," I shouted back, my voice cracking with desperation. The walls were closing in, the faces pressing closer, their expressions of glee and hunger an unbearable sight. But Sarah wasn't listening. She was already scanning the chamber, her eyes darting wildly in search of an escape. "There has to be a way out," she muttered, more to herself than to me. "There's always a way out." The creature let out a low, guttural laugh, a sound that reverberated through the chamber like the tolling of a death knell. "There is no escape," it said, its voice a dark, resonant growl that seemed to emanate from the very walls. "You belong to the abyss now." The words struck me like a physical blow, a chilling finality that made my knees buckle. I could feel the abyss closing in around me, its oppressive weight pressing down on my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. The faces on the walls were laughing now, their voices blending into a grotesque symphony of mockery and malice. And then I saw it. At the far end of the chamber, partially obscured by the writhing mass of maws and tendrils, was a small opening, a narrow tunnel that seemed to lead away from the chamber. It was barely visible, its edges flickering faintly in the dim light, but it was there. "Sarah," I shouted, pointing toward the opening. "There's a way out." Her eyes followed my gaze, and for a moment I saw a flicker of hope in her expression. "Come on," she shouted, pulling me toward the tunnel. The creature roared, a deafening, bone-rattling sound that shook the entire chamber. It lunged forward, its massive claws slicing through the air with terrifying speed. The floor erupted in a frenzy of snapping jaws and writhing tendrils, the maws snapping and tearing at everything in their path. We ran. The tunnel was narrow, barely wide enough for us to squeeze through, and the walls were slick with the same viscous substance that coated the chamber. The air was stifling, thick with the stench of rot and the faint metallic tang of blood. The sound of the creature's pursuit was deafening, its growls and roars echoing through the tunnel like thunder. Behind us, the maws continued to snap and writhe, their wet, tearing noises growing fainter as we pushed deeper into the tunnel. But the creature was relentless. Its massive frame should have made it impossible for it to follow us, but it seemed to defy all logic, its twisted body contorting and shifting to fit through the narrow space. The tunnel twisted and turned, its layout as chaotic and nonsensical as the rest of the labyrinth. Every corner we turned felt like a dead end, every step forward a gamble. The whispers were louder now, more insistent, their voices filling my mind with a maddening cacophony of despair and resignation. "You cannot escape. You belong to us. Give in." The tunnel began to change, the walls growing more erratic and unstable. They pulsed and shifted, their surfaces rippling like liquid, and the faint light that guided us flickered and dimmed. The air grew colder, the darkness pressing in on us from all sides, and I could feel the abyss closing in, its presence an inescapable weight that made every step a struggle. And then, suddenly, the tunnel ended. We stumbled into a vast open space, a cavernous void that stretched endlessly in all directions. The floor was a slick, black expanse, its surface reflective and eerily still, like a pool of liquid darkness. Above us, the ceiling was an unbroken expanse of shadow, and the faint light that had guided us before was gone, leaving us in near total darkness. The creature emerged from the tunnel behind us, its massive frame silhouetted against the faint glow of the pulsating walls. It stood there, its smile now a grotesque leer, its eyes burning with a malevolent light. "There is no escape," it said, its voice a deep, resonant growl that seemed to emanate from the very air. "The abyss has claimed you." Sarah took a step back, her eyes wide with terror. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. The void stretched out before us, an endless expanse of nothingness, and the creature was blocking the only exit. We were trapped, caught between the abyss and the monster that served it. The creature took a step forward, its claws glinting in the dim light. The floor beneath it rippled and shifted, the black surface bubbling and churning as though alive. And then, the void spoke. Enough. The voice was not a sound, but a presence, a vast, incomprehensible force that filled the cavern with its will. The creature froze, its smile faltering for the first time, and the walls of the cavern began to pulse with a sickly green light. The void was alive, and it was hungry. The floor beneath the creature erupted, a massive maw opening to swallow it whole. The creature screamed, its voice a horrifying blend of rage and despair as it was dragged into the abyss. The black surface closed over it, leaving no trace of its existence. The cavern began to collapse, the walls crumbling into the void, and I realized with a chilling certainty that we were next. "Run!" Sarah shouted, but there was nowhere to go. The abyss had claimed us. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Tell me, if you heard whispers in the dark, would you dare look behind you, or would you rather not know?